Welcome to the How of Business with your host, Henry Lopez, the podcast that helps you start, run, and grow your small business. And now, here is your host.
Welcome to the How of Business. This is Henry Lopez, and my guest co-host today is David Begin. David, welcome to this episode.
Thanks for having me, Henry. I always enjoy being on your podcast.
Yeah, this is going to be a good conversation on this episode. David and I are going to discuss the practice and habit of concentrated time blocks of focused work, which is critical to completing valuable work. And yet it's becoming increasingly rare in our current lives for all kinds of different reasons that we'll chat about. You may call this time blocking or time boxing, although that's really more about time management. You've probably more realistically heard it referred to as focus time, or as we're going to explore, both David and I read Cal Newport's book named Deep Work. We'll discuss just a few key points from that book. We're going to try to do it justice. But the book, again, is Deep Work by Cal Newport. And we encourage you to read this book to learn more about this important topic. And so that's what we're going to explore on this episode, deep work, especially from a small business owner's perspective. To receive more information about the How of Business, including the links to the show notes page for this episode, and how you can continue supporting my show and receive exclusive content and discounts through a Patreon membership, please visit thehowofbusiness.com. Also, I want to take a moment to thank a couple of my listeners and a couple of my coaching program clients as well, Sylvie in Minnesota and Blair in Vancouver. Thanks for listening and for the opportunity to serve as your small business coach. All right, let's get into it, Dave. Let's talk about deep work. I think I'll start it off by defining the problem. And this is kind of a breakdown that's similar to what Cal Newport covers in the book. But again, let's give you the definition that he gives. And again, we're talking about the book, Deep Work, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World by Cal Newport. He also authored a very popular book entitled So Good They Can't Ignore You. And he coined that term deep work in a series of articles that he published in his popular blog entitled Study Hacks, Decoding Patterns of Success. So here's his high-level definition of deep work from the book. Deep work is professional activities performed in a state of distraction-free concentration that push your cognitive thinking, so cognitive meaning thinking, reasoning, remembering, your cognitive capabilities rather, to their limit. These efforts create new value, improve your skill, and are hard to replicate. So that's the definition. We'll start with David for deep work.
Yeah, that's such a great definition. And when you think about that, it's becoming, as Cal said, and we realize it's becoming more of a rare skill that people have to be able to do this. And for many, many different reasons. I mean, we can get into that later, but there's a ton of reasons why deep work is so important, but also why many people don't have the ability to do it anymore.
Yeah, and he argues that we're losing that. The opposite is what he calls shallow work, which is non-cognitively demanding, logistical style tasks, often performed while distracted. So you're trying to do multiple things at once. And these efforts tend not to create much new value in the world and are easy to replicate. And we certainly can fall into that mode of operating as small business owners, right?
Yeah. And the problem we have with being a small business owner is the work that we do lends itself toward shallow work.
Yes.
Because we're firefighters many times.
Mm-hmm.
So we're either doing it all or we're doing most of it, or we're making sure it's getting done. And it's very easy to be distracted. And that was a big problem I had when I owned my businesses in the car wash industry, is that industry lends itself so much to firefighting and shallow work. And when you perform shallow work, you feel like, okay, I'm really getting something done. But if you had to sit down and look at the end of the day, did you really get anything done or not? And I think it's a big question a lot of us have got to ask. And I've been reading articles here recently say a lot of jobs nowadays don't require deep work, and people are just, checking emails and answering phone calls. And, as a knowledge worker, are we really producing something unique, and are we really improving things in our business? And I think a lot of people are challenged with that.
Yeah, and of course he speaks to this in the book, that even from a career perspective, what he's predicting is people who can do deep work will be the ones that prosper as AI evolves, as technologies evolve. So he thinks it's critical to those who are going to be rewarded and have success or more success in the future.
Yeah, exactly.
So the hypothesis that he puts together, or puts forward rather, about deep work is that the ability to perform deep work is becoming increasingly rare, as we just talked about. And at exactly the time it's becoming valuable in our economy. And like I just said, and I think as it relates to small businesses, as you articulated, I think you were a poster child sometimes for what you had to do in the early days of starting your car wash business, where you were a firefighter. That's the best analogy for it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then when you think back to that, I'm curious, when you think back to those days, 10 years ago or more, how did you find time for the deeper thinking? When did you do that, and how was that process?
I would do that when I wasn't working. I would, and the problem was I was thinking about it all the time. So I never gave my brain a break, not thinking about the car wash and what was going on. And that was, not serving me in many different ways, which I think you're going to talk about a little later on.
Yep.
But I just thought about it all the time. And, as a distractible individual, it fed that addiction. And it felt like it was okay because I was, quote unquote, getting things done. I'll give you an example. The reason why I created my new company was because we could never create a policy and procedures manual. It was like 10 years before I got a policy and procedures manual, and somebody else had to do it because I kept trying to do it. And that's one of those functions that requires massive amount of work.
Mm-hmm.
I think Matt, on the other hand, who works with me, has a tremendous amount of focus. He can sit down for 10 hours and crank more content out than anybody I know. Thank goodness, because I still can't do it. And so he's created this policy and procedures manual that probably took him 1,000 to 1,500 hours worth of work. That's an example of what deep work is. And most of us either don't do it or don't get much of an opportunity to do it.
Yeah. And as business owners, we develop the opposite habit, which is that firefighter mode, especially in the early days of starting a business. I have to be accessible and available to everybody. I'm the one that has to make the big decisions. I need to be there every day. It's just all of the classic stuff. All of the reasons why we work towards that owner independent business are for all of those things that we do. Those are habits that are contrary to deep work.
Yeah. And it feels good. That's the problem.
It does,
is it feels good as if you're getting something completed. But to me, it's like eating candy. It feels good when you do it, but then eventually you're going to get a stomach ache.
Yeah.
And so, but the other thing is there, sometimes I wish we were in jobs and businesses that required deep work. Cal Newport talks about his ability to produce papers. I mean, and there's an index he was talking about in the book that professors are judged on, right? The number of classes they do, the number of papers they produce. If you're in a research institution, he's got a super high score, and he does a bunch of other things. So he's one guy that has really developed the ability to get a whole lot of things done, even more so than his colleagues are able to do in many cases. But because he's mastered this, but most of us aren't put in a position where we have to do this. And I almost wish I was in a position or a job where my job was just to produce content or do deep thinking, because going back and forth can be difficult.
Absolutely. The other point that he makes is he doesn't do this by working more hours. He purposely does not work in the evenings. I think he doesn't work much on the weekends either. So it's not that he does that by working harder than the next guy, which is, again, what we were, I don't know, maybe indoctrinated, maybe our parents taught us this, is the whole, what we call work ethic. But there's this sense of pride and a badge that we put on ourselves being, I put in 80 hours this week, right?
Well, yeah. And it's this whole mantra, I'm so busy. Like,
that's right.
How you doing? Oh, I'm so busy.
Really busy.
That becomes the answer now many times. And I wish, if we can communicate anything else, is working more is always not the answer. We can always throw more time at the problem, but we've got to, if we're going to be successful in a small business, if our small business is going to be successful, or we want to grow that small business into a medium-sized business, we got to be able to do the right things. And the right things does require this deep work, and it requires us to work smarter, which we've all heard. but it also requires us to pick the right things to do, and then to discipline or train our brains not to say, okay, I've just hit kind of a little bit of a lull. Let me get on Facebook and see what's going on.
Exactly. We search for that really quickly, and we'll come back to that because those are such important things. I also want to come back to the point he makes in the book about collaborative deep work, because when I first started the book, reading the book, I thought where he was going to go is this is something you have to do by yourself. It's the only way to get into deep, concentrated work, but that's not necessarily the case, depending on the type of work that you're doing. And I know, you and I, for example, have locked ourselves into a meeting room before and done deep work collaboratively, right?
Yeah.
So that is not to say, the takeaway is not that deep work is always done in isolation or by yourself.
Right. But sometimes it is. And
a lot of times it is. Yeah.
He talks about how to, define your space. It could be like your office. Is your office an easily distractible office or not? He talked about, either, turn off the distractions that are around you. Those things are super important, but, we can control our environment to a large extent. Those of us who kind of control our work lives. So, if you're going to do that, you got to create an environment. If you're, one thing with the car wash, which was really interesting, is it made such a difference for the administrative staff when I moved out of the car washes, working in the car washes, to an office, because, the administrative people can't get anything done in that environment because it's so noisy.
Right. It's just the noise of it and the distractions, and there's always something going on, or, oh, somebody just got derailed in the tunnel. Oh, somebody's not having a problem at the pay station. Oh, somebody lost their money, or whatever it is. There's always something that's a major distraction in that environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So to talk a little bit more about the problem, he quotes a 2012 McKinsey study that found that the average knowledge worker, and as I was thinking about this, as a business owner, I think I would consider ourselves as knowledge workers, but obviously, depending on our business, we may actually have knowledge workers on our team working with us or for us. So you can apply this in many ways. But again, the average knowledge worker now spends more than 60% of their work week engaged in electronic communication and internet searching, with close to 30% of the worker's time dedicated to reading and answering email alone. This is partly what you were touching on earlier, David.
Right.
The point is that if we have on our team knowledge workers, or us as business owners, we fall into that category because we have to produce this content. We have to make decisions about where our business is going, or where we're going to pivot, or what we're going to add or not add, or if we're going to increase pricing or not, and what's the impact of that. All of those things are knowledge work type activities. Yet, as we've just articulated, and this study shows more conclusively, we are so distracted.
Yes, incredibly distracted.
And doing shallow work, right?
Yeah. So answering emails is shallow work. Looking at social media or reading the newspaper online sometimes is shallow work. So absolutely.
So you touched on it already, but he lumps all of these technological distractions into what he calls network tools. So that includes email, texting, social media, and the like, all of those platforms, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, all of those. And his argument, and I agree, is that network tools are distracting us from work that requires unbroken concentration, while simultaneously degrading our capacity to remain focused. Now, he goes on, I'm interested in your thoughts on this point. There's a couple points in the book where he thinks that it's irreversible, this damage that it does to our ability to go back to focusing. I don't know if I agree with that. What are your thoughts?
I would probably disagree with that, because I don't believe anybody has limitations. So I believe if you want to focus on something and do it, you can do it. But I might be wrong about that, but that's just my core belief, that you can change anything about yourself that you feel like you need to change.
Agreed, because later on, of course, as we'll talk about more, he talks about this being a habit. Now, habits are hard to break and new ones are hard to build, but it can be done.
Yeah, it can be done. As far as multitasking, this gets into the whole subject of multitasking. I think everybody's pretty clear at this point that multitasking is not helpful. So you can't really do 2 or 3 things at one time.
No.
And they talked about, something in his book that was interesting, that if people were multitasking and they moved on to the second task, their ability to perform the second task was about 50% of what it needed to be.
Yeah.
So, as you know, that's one big issue is trying to focus on doing too many things at one time.
Absolutely. And then there was a term as well. I'm looking for my notes here. Residual. There was a residual, and I know this is that switching cost, right? Your brain, if you're working on something important, and now you switch to an interruption or something else you got to go take care of, or the next big thing, part of you is still thinking about that project or deep work that you were working on. And so that makes you even less focused on the next thing that you're trying to tackle.
Yeah. And we're dealing with social media tools that are designed to be incredibly addictive.
Yes.
So, when we're bored or we're stuck or something and we don't want to push through the thought process of trying to figure it out, it's very easy to get distracted and, check Facebook or check TikTok or whatever your thing is. It's incredibly easy to do it. It's very addicting, and it becomes my mental out when I'm tired. I'll just get online and kind of scroll through and see what's going on with the weather, or going on with the news, or checking Facebook, or just to kind of see what's happening. And I think that's there's a lot of things out there that are pushing against this.
Absolutely. And those are habits, or maybe even a level of addictions. But that's what's happening. If we talk about it more from a business owner's perspective, some of the common distractions, you touched on it, focusing on too many things at once. So I'm trying to get all of these projects done, all of these things done on top of the day-to-day responsibilities that I might have, on top of however many people are coming to me, bombarding me with questions, or coming to me to make a decision. This is why it's so important to continue to build a business that doesn't rely just on you, and empowering your people, developing the systems so that, as Michael Gerber very famously put it in the E-Myth, working on your business, not in your business.
Right.
But that's key. But you touch on it, David. I think that sometimes what happens to us as business owners is because we needed to do that initially, we hang on to that because it feeds our ego to an extent, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah. If you're not delegating properly to your team or your staff, and you feel like you're the one that's got to come in and rescue it and do it, then there's a lot of problems with that. But with that, it does make you feel better. So when you're not feeling better, trying to solve a hard problem, your brain goes to, how can I feel better? Mm-hmm. Well, I can step in and take over, solve the problem for people, or I can get on social media.
That's right. And get a little bit dopamine hit there, or get distracted, right? Allowing our teams to interrupt us is related to that. We may have conditioned them that they have to come to us for every major decision. We may have enabled them to have poor decision-making abilities. And so all of those things are things we got to look at to see if we haven't created this environment in our small business that creates constant disruption.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And that was my problem for years. And then toward the end of my car wash career, I started asking people to come. If you've got a problem, you better come with a solution. And I sort of had the mantra, I'm not doing your thinking for you anymore. And it was tough to break that habit, but eventually they got pretty good at it, which was encouraging for me. But I allowed it, first of all, because they were afraid to make it as the wrong decision. So I didn't let them make the wrong decision. If they made the wrong decision, there was penalties associated with that. So they kind of went into, I'm not going to make any decisions, so I'm going to ask you on every decision. Plus, I think our younger generations, they want the answers. And so they don't want to risk making the wrong decision because they're used to, I have to have the right answer. And so in many cases, we've got to teach them to think through problems as well. I've talked about this in my podcast and probably on yours. There was this whole thing about 3-2-1, and I can't find where in the world that is anymore, because I've looked it up, but I've heard it, where you say, I've got a problem. Here's 3 solutions that we could potentially do. I'm going to narrow it down to these 2. and here's the one I would recommend you would do, and here's why. I tried to implement that. I didn't have great success, but at least it was the idea of, I'm not doing your thinking for you anymore.
But I think you're not giving yourself enough credit. Towards the latter years, you did have success with that because you really believed in it. In other words, I think earlier it might have been something that was interesting. I'll try this, but I'm not really buying it. But once you really realized the value of it, I think you were doing it well.
Yeah.
Like with when you brought on Matt, I think you were taking that approach very effectively.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I delegated the decision-making. The thing I struggled with was getting people to do this 3-2-1 idea.
Yeah. Because you're helping them develop a habit, and it's not easy. It requires constant reinforcement. And they also have to trust that this isn't the latest management technique that you picked up at a seminar somewhere, right? That you really do believe this, and that I'm no longer going to face the wrath of David if I make a mistake, right?
Right.
And that you are really empowering me to make decisions and to think for myself.
Yeah, you have to teach them to think for themselves, which encourages that. But you got to, like you said, you got to create a safe environment for them to make decisions. Hey, they're going to mess up. Let them mess up. Let them figure it out. They'll fix it. But it got so much better when people were coming to me with problems and potential solutions, because a lot of times all I had to say was, okay, that sounds good. Let's do that.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have to put any thought into it.
Yeah.
And that's the big thing we've talked about this before, Henry, the decision fatigue that business owners get into, because they've got to make a ton of decisions on their own, plus everybody else's decisions.
Right.
And at the end of the day, you're just, you're fried when it comes to making decisions.
So all of those are distractions that keep us from doing deep work. The other thing that is a distraction that I think a lot of times we don't think about is our clients, customers, patients. We allow them to, quote unquote, interrupt us. And what I mean by that is that certainly in the early days, we will jump through whatever hoop to land that engagement or get that customer. Oh, you want it at 7:00 on Saturday night? Of course I'll be there, right? So we'll do those things. We will make those sacrifices, understandably, at first. But what I find is then that becomes just the way that you operate. And first of all, people will abuse that, right? Because they want what they want now. Yeah. But you have to set boundaries. Otherwise, that consumes your ability to do deep work.
Yes. And I think that's where you come into time blocking. I think we're going to talk about that a little later on, but that's where maybe you block times for different activities. And I worked with a lady when I worked in software. It was interesting. She would never return emails or phone calls until the afternoon. Mm-hmm. And she just said, I don't return calls until the afternoon. And it was the first time I ever heard anybody say that.
Yeah. And that took some discipline, right? Plus she may have lost some customers, clients. I don't know what business she was in, that were like, oh, no, I'm not going to deal with it. And that's okay. That's okay. Right. These are my rules for me to get the work done that I need to get done.
Yeah. And I don't think she probably didn't lose customers. I think she just trained her customers that you'll hear from me in the afternoon.
Well said.
And most times nothing's an emergency.
That's right.
Makes it an emergency, but you can talk to somebody in the afternoon. That's okay.
Absolutely. Especially if you in fact do. In other words, there's a difference between having that rule or having a rule that says, oh, but now I'm tired. Now I'll get back to them tomorrow. And now you develop a reputation for somebody who doesn't follow back up. It doesn't return your call. And we've had those relationships as well in business.
Sure. And it seems like more and more often people ghost you. And where when you and I started in business, it was appropriate to follow up with people and call them back. And even if you had to say, no, we're not going to do it, you went to those levels of you would do that. But now a lot of people just don't do those things, which drove you and I crazy, but we've accepted.
That's the way it is. Exactly right. It drives everybody crazy, of our generation in particular. So we touched on switching costs, and I just want to briefly summarize on that point, because I think it is a misconception that you can do any kind of significant or deep work simultaneously, juggling multiple projects. It just cannot be done. They've done multiple scientific studies, evaluations. Lots of people have written about this. It just doesn't work. And you can do it for superficial tasks, for those kind of things that don't require deep thinking. But if it's a major project or something you really got to spend some time on thinking about, you have to focus on that one subject.
Yes. Yes.
You had mentioned it, but in the book, he calls it attention residue as well when you try to switch from one thing to another.
That's correct. Yeah. That's where that 50%, you're only able to focus about 50% because of the residue from the other task.
The danger is, again, as he argues in the book, that you can lose your ability to perform deep work. We already expressed our opinion on that, but I think what I will take from that is that, as with any other habits, the longer you ingrain a habit in yourself, in your organization, the harder it is to change, right?
Right. And I think it gets to that level where it becomes an ingrained habit and your brain becomes rewired. So you rewire your brain for distractions. And I think that's where maybe it gets more difficult to change that. You can do it, but it's much, much more difficult to try to change it versus keep it.
Yeah. So that's a lot of what the problem is and how we've experienced it, how we see it in small business. Let's shift now to briefly the opportunity, and then what are some of the rules, as some of them that he puts forth in the book and some of them that you and I have learned from different sources, different things that we've read, different practices of our own. But the opportunity that he shares, to summarize it, which I think is interesting, is he says that deep work leads to two core abilities that are needed to thrive in the new economy. And that is, number one, the ability to quickly master hard things. So deep work helps you quickly learn hard things. And number two is the ability to produce at an elite level in terms of both quality and speed. You mentioned the point about how many of these papers he can produce without adding extra hours, just by being focused. So deep work helps you produce at an elite level. I want to talk about the first one primarily, and I wanted to ask you, as I was doing the research and reading the book, I was thinking about you on this point about the ability to master hard things. You have always, one of the things that's always impressed me about you is the ability you have of learning new things. For example, when you got your pilot's license, but more importantly, not too long ago, when you got your commercial rating. You were doing that in the middle of juggling out. You actively had the car washes, you were juggling a lot of things. How did you find the time to concentrate on that deep work?
Well, it was something I enjoyed, I think, which made a big difference. I think when you enjoy what you're doing, it makes concentration a lot easier. That's one of the things. The rest of it, I don't know. I mean, I just used to work like a maniac. When I owned the car washes, I was working all day and all night a lot of times. And when you and I were trying to start multiple businesses, we had a lot of different ideas and different thoughts going on. And I was working 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, most nights. So I was throwing quantity at it. I don't think I was throwing quantity. I wasn't throwing quality at it.
So do you think it took you then, as a result, longer to get your commercial rating, as an example, than it would have if you had blocked out some deep work time?
I think I did it within a pretty reasonable time frame, but I don't know. I'll be honest with you. I don't know how I did it.
Well, one way you did it, you spoke to, which is you sacrificed a lot of other time. In other words, you just threw in more time.
Yeah. I was never very good at how do I utilize my time. It's only here recently where that's become top of mind for me, but I considered my time like an unlimited resource.
Yeah.
And I've paid the price for it. I think I've paid the price a little bit from a health perspective. I think I've paid the price from I didn't spend as much time with my kids as I probably would like to have, where I think you did a better job of focusing on that. I felt like if I was providing for my family, then that was the most important thing. And they'll love me if they get to go to college,
Right.
but that wasn't right. I never prioritized those things that I should have been prioritizing, and work was always the number one thing. And there's some real regrets in there for me that I wished I would have done it differently.
Sure. Yeah. You sacrificed some things that now, looking back, you wish maybe you had not sacrificed as much in.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I didn't really have to, right? This is great information for me now, and I'm trying to apply it, but I never applied it.
Yeah, no, I mean, and if somebody would have told you to, you would have just completely ignored it. So,
Well, because I didn't know how to do it, right? I didn't.
Yeah.
Nobody ever said, "Hey, Dave, why don't you think about working smarter?" Because that's how we did it in the software business.
Yeah,
We worked harder, right? We
that's
showed
the way
up
we
on
learned.
Saturday morning.
But the thing is, though, it gets more ingrained because, hey, look, I'm having success, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
My career progressed, and then my businesses are flourishing. So, what are you arguing with? And I think that's also goes back to why Cal makes the point, in my opinion, and my interpretation, as to why it's hard to reverse once you're down that path.
That's right. Because there's a lot of things that come alongside you and say you're doing great. You're doing good. You're working hard. There's nothing.
And all of those external signals of success are blinking green. They're saying, yes, yes, yes. Look, you've got two of the most productive car washes in the industry. You had success in your career. You're a pilot. You've done this. You've done that. You must be doing it the right way.
Yeah. That's exactly right. So,
okay. Let's talk about some of the rules, and some again, these are some from the book, and some of that you and I have learned and applied from other areas in our experiences in life. But he talks about picking a depth philosophy, and this is what I took from it. Tell me if you got a different interpretation. Essentially, to simplify it, that you have to either choose an approach where you eliminate everything else, maybe like the person you just mentioned, where she doesn't answer emails or anything until the end of the day, or you do time blocking. Some approach to that effect. I think that as small business owners, most of us, as we just talked about, can't get away with saying, I'll return your call tomorrow, or to my manager, hey, I'll talk to you next week. I'm deep in a project right now. So I think we have to take the time blocking approach to our depth philosophy. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say the vast majority of what the type of work that we do and the listeners on this podcast do is probably more conducive to time blocking. I think it is difficult to eliminate and because the jobs that we do don't really require it. If you're a solopreneur and you doing like a doctor, for example, you're dealing with patients. You're not making money unless you're seeing patients. So you can't eliminate that. So you've got to go into a time blocking mode. Exactly.
All right. The next thing that he talks about is ritualizing. And I do believe in a lot of this. Just to continue with the example of a doctor, one of my coaching clients is a doctor. And for her, one of the things she's trying to do is, again, work on her practice, not as much in the practice, which for her means less hours with patients, understandably. But she finds that if she's there physically at the practice, she gets sucked into it, right? So it's best for her to do her deep work or her outside of seeing patients work somewhere else, home office, wherever else it might be. And I know for you, again, and I fought you for a long time, but the desire to have a separate physical office away from the car washes was huge for you when you made that move, wasn't it?
Yeah. It really got us focused, got the administrative team doing what they're supposed to do, got me from showing up to the car washes every day, which wasn't necessary since I hired Matt. So it made a much better environment from getting getting work done.
What is there? I know for me there is, but what times of the day are best for you to block out deep work time?
I'm much more productive in the morning, and typically early morning, because we're early risers. We get up, around 5 o'clock. And so I usually block off a couple hours in the morning to get other things done. And about 7 o'clock, I'm raring to go. I usually am at my desk somewhere around 7, and I've got 2 or 3 hours, probably till 9 or 9:30. That is probably my best time. So early morning for me. How about you?
Early morning is the worst time for me because that's usually when I'm getting my best sleep because I have so many sleep issues. So my productive deep work times are actually sometimes in the evening. Or it could be, 10 a.m. to lunchtime. I have a productive window there. After lunch, as most people do, it's a lull, right? Because I'm processing the food. So I have these blocks in the day, usually in the evening. Sometimes I do most of my writing at night. And that's when I get into another productive mode. Yeah. I think the takeaway here is a couple of things I want to talk about. First is you have to understand and acknowledge your personal rhythms and whatever influences that. The challenge, though, for small business owners and why your model typically works better is that morning is when you're more likely to not be interrupted by your staff, by your team, by the operations of the business, right? So
Yes.
often for small business owners, if you can block out and if you are productive in the morning before your business starts, I think that's the most powerful time to do deep thinking if possible.
Yeah. And a lot of people use that 5 a.m. time to kind of do their journaling and writing. There's been some books that have been written about getting up early and doing those things. And for me, it was just nice having that time, that especially with the car wash, the uninterrupted time before the car wash opened.
You have a home now, you're an empty nester like I am. So finding quiet space is not a challenge, but back when you had the kids at home or if you have visitors or whatever, what are some of the places that you go that are conducive to deep work?
Yeah, I had an office downstairs in the basement, kind of far away, and I could close the door if I needed to. So that worked well for me. And it also opens up the whole conversation, Henry, about this work from home philosophy. Do you think people are more productive or less productive at home?
I think it's the big question of our current era. I think it depends. I think that what you're going to find is the reason why corporations in particular, maybe not so much for their knowledge workers, but they're anxiously awaiting the opportunity to say, come back to work. It's just right now they can't get away with it, right? Because the employees have more control right now because it's such a tight labor market. But I think that there's so many distractions working from home for most people. For me, it's fantastic, but I've been doing it for 20 plus years. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that if you can create a space that is separate and allows you to concentrate and do deep work, then yes, it's fantastic. If your space doesn't allow for that for all kinds of different reasons that might happen at home, then you're going to have a hard time doing deep work in that space.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it goes, this whole work from home idea, it'll be interesting. Which way it goes. And there's arguments for both sides, right? You don't have the commute issues. You don't have the expense issues that you have by going into an office, but you also miss the collaboration in an office. And a lot of people don't like working at home. So what are they, what do they do?
Exactly.
So,
and I think what's happening is the in-between, the hybrid, which is part of what we're trying to serve with the business that I'm a minority partner in, Office Evolutions, which is to provide a co-working or shared space that's close to home, but not home. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's another solution for people if they need to get work done. And for your doctor client, for example, maybe working at home isn't effective for them and working at the office isn't effective. Maybe getting a shared space that they can go to 1 or 2 days a week where they're going someplace completely different where they don't have the distractions might be helpful.
Absolutely. We have plenty of clients that do that, that come, they are home-based, home office, but when they need to do that concentrated work, they'll come and rent a small conference room and lock themselves in there and do deep work. I do think I have found over time, even though I work from home very effectively, nonetheless, I have used sometimes changing it up. I might go to a library. I might go somewhere else where I can find a quiet space. I'm not a cafe type of person because I get distracted, but everybody's different. So find the point here on ritualization is to find what is it that is conducive to your thinking and producing great work. You and I are going to hopefully go down to Key West later this year. We were going to, and then it got postponed by COVID, but we're going to go see Hemingway's house, right? So Hemingway, when we go see that house, you'll notice that over the carriage house, a separate building where they used to put carriages and then those became garages. And the second floor was his writing studio. And then there's a little catwalk that goes from the second floor of the main house over to that studio. And so that's where he would go religiously every day. I forget how many hours he would block out and he'd go write. Famously, he was asked, how are you so prolific? How is it that you write? And he says, I just write every day. I just write every day. Mm-hmm. But that was his space where it was conducive to him. And of course, he had multiple spaces because he only lived in Key West for a period of time. He did the same thing when he lived in in Cuba, not in Havana necessarily. But the point is that deep work that's required for creativity or anything related to our business, sometimes we have to find the right space that motivates and is conducive to it.
Yeah. And I would put Hemingway in that category of people that have to do deep work. Their work is deep work. And
That's
so
right.
they don't have a choice. If they're going to get it done, they've got to develop a deep work mentality like that, where they can sit and do something for hours and hours and hours. And I think that's way on the other end of the spectrum from most of us, where we've got to figure out how to do a hybrid. I wish we could be like Hemingway, where we didn't have any distractions. Our job was just to write a book, and we could focus all our efforts on one thing.
But the reality is, as business owners, it doesn't work that way. In fact, going back to the point I made earlier, often it's collaborative deep work. And Cal Newport talks about this in the book as well. I mentioned that you and I have done some of that, but one of the ways I also see business owners doing this effectively is taking your leadership team off site, or one or two of your key people somewhere other than the office, where you lock yourselves in a meeting room and you think together. And I think that's a very effective way to address it in small business.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Matt and I will take a day and go skiing. And if we're not already up in Breckenridge, we'll drive up there. And that's 2 hours of time that we've got together to talk about things. And then when we're skiing, on the chairlift, we're talking about things. And in the evenings, we're talking about things. So just getting yourself out of that environment, or your normal environment, sometimes makes a big impression.
Right. As we've touched on, to me, the approach that we have to take as small business owners is to be ruthless about planning and time blocking. I like to take the approach of planning out my week, but then on a day-to-day basis, of course, you're making adjustments for the reality of what might have come up, but trying to block out those focus blocks or focus times and being realistic. In other words, it's not realistic, if you've never done any of this, to say, oh, okay, well, Wednesdays, I'm going to block out the entire day for deep work. That's not going to work. That's just setting yourself up for failure. In fact, I think for me, this is what works for me, that if I try to do deep work for more than about an hour, I start, my abilities start to wane there towards the end. That's my attention span for a lot of deep work. For you, it might be different. You have to find out what works for you, right?
Yeah. And I think mine is probably around an hour. I think Cal Newport talks about the window is usually for the people that are really good at it, is about a 2-3 hour time block.
Yeah. Yeah. But I want you to think about, if you're not doing this, to work up to that. Don't set that as a goal your first week in blocking out deep work time, because you're going to be frustrated when you fail at it. You have got to first set up this environment. You first have to show your people and train them and educate them on how you want this time to be respected. And you have to have done a lot of the work ahead. If you are in an environment like we described, where everybody has to come to you to make a decision, everything has to go through you, where you're going to find it hard to block out much time then that's uninterrupted.
Right.
So I think you have to begin to address those things first, but start small by blocking out, ideally for most people, in the morning, before your team comes in, before you open the doors for business. That's usually a sweet spot for most people.
Yes.
Block out that 1 hour there, maybe once a week to begin with, and then grow it from there. That's my recommendation.
Yeah, I would agree. Just find a time and start telling your staff, hey, I've got an hour here. I've got to get something done. If you'll hold your questions for an hour, typically nothing's an emergency and they can wait until you're finished.
He recommends quitting social media. What are your thoughts on that? I
think it's a great idea. I don't think most of us can't do it.
I don't think so.
But
I think we've become so dependent on it.
Yeah,
that it would be hard to quit altogether. Now, my excuse is, well, I'm monitoring it for my businesses, right? Because I'm responsible for the Facebook page, that's true. But I still could just do that I could probably do that in 2 hour blocks of time a week, and then the rest of the time I could have it shut off.
Yeah, I think if you put it in a block, if you're highly addicted to it, maybe give yourself 30 minutes toward the end of the day as a reward. But he recommends taking a vacation from it for 30 days and seeing how you do. And I think that would be a great exercise for most people. Say, I'm not going to get on Facebook for 30 days and see if your life's any better or any worse. And most people will say it was a lot better.
I think that would be a great experiment. I think that would be a great experiment for most people. I did that once with television. My television, I moved from one apartment to another. and my TV broke. I only had one at the time. And I said, you know what, I'm going to go without. And I did it for a year. And I learned a lot. I learned that, first of all, I didn't die. So
Yeah.
I survived. I'd even not being able to watch my sports, I survived. And now when I moved here, I used to have DirecTV. So I'd get all the live channels, ESPN and all of that. I don't have any of that now. And every once in a while I think, God, I wish I could watch what's going on in sports, but I don't miss it now that I've gotten past it.
Yeah.
So it is an addiction that we have to this stuff.
It really is. It really is. And it's designed to be addictive. That's the thing that it's insidious what they do to develop these applications and the way they give us their scroll the feeds and keep us interested. And now, there's these short, like TikTok type videos that are on Facebook. And I sometimes fall down the rabbit hole of watching those, which are stupid. And I'm like, what am I doing?
It's great. It's amazing. TikTok in particular. I mean, TikTok is the champion. Their algorithm is at another level. We could do a whole nother show about how effective their algorithm is to serving you stuff that keeps you engaged.
Yeah. And I'm not on TikTok. So
good for you.
I'm fighting Facebook and other things, but these other Instagrams and TikToks, I'm going to pass by those.
All right. One other point I want to touch on, which we've kind of touched on, is he talks about being lazy. And that, again, you and I chatted, our background is to not be working. We feel guilty. We feel like we're doing something bad. We're not putting in all of our effort, but it's in that downtime that's so valuable. Not that you're doing deep work in that downtime, although insights might come to you, but it recharges you to be able to then do the deep work.
Yes. And I still struggle with that. When I'm not working at night or working on the weekends, I feel like, I could be getting
you feel
a lot
guilty.
of stuff done. And I'm hoping it's going to get better. I think it will get better. But when I'm not working in the evenings or weekends, I still struggle with it.
Dan Sullivan refers to this concept in part as free days, right?
Yeah. And the idea about free days with Dan Sullivan was it's good for you as an individual, but it also becomes a demonstrator to you that your business will still run. So it also lets you know where the holes are in your staffing. He's very big about developing a self-managed company, which, is what you're focused on with your coaching and consulting. But, a free day does two things. It helps the individual, but it also lets gives your team the ability to show that they can do the job. That's right.
Right. It allows them to be empowered to make decisions, and that's critical.
Right.
All right. We'll start to wrap it up. I think, the couple of big takeaways that we'll start to articulate here, David. What is that? If you're in any kind of position, certainly as a business owner, or you're aspiring to become a business owner, but this applies even if you're in a career, the ability to do deep work is important and will become ever more important as we move into this future that brings in technologies and complex tools and AI and so forth. That's the argument that he makes, and I agree with it. I see it even regardless of that in small business. The small business owners who get their businesses to the next level have this ability to do deep work. And in part, some of the spin-off values or I don't know, benefits, if you will, are what we've talked about, that your staff now is empowered and properly developed to make decisions so that you're not having to make all those decisions. So that's a byproduct of you being able to take those concentrated chunks of time where you're uninterrupted. Yeah.
Right.
But these are habits, and habits, especially as we've said, that have been deeply ingrained are hard to change. So understand that, go into it with that concept, just like any other habits, whether they're eating habits or health habits or whatever it might be, you really have to put in the effort to change these deeply ingrained habits, right?
Yes. And this could be the most difficult habit to change of all.
I think so. This is not easy. And that's what I think he speaks to in the book as well, as to how eroding and how corrosive this can be and how difficult it is to change, to the point where he believes that it may not be possible to change once you go too deep into the shallow end of thinking. Yeah.
Yes.
I thought we've shared a lot of tips, but I want to share, and then I want you to think about maybe one other, it might be a simple tip, but I'll tell you a hack that I applied for myself, and then I'll share with you kind of the next step that I'm going to take with this. It's been about 4 years, probably longer now. I used to have for my Outlook email where every time I'd receive an email, it would notify me, at the bottom of the screen, it pops up new email. And I loved that, right? That was a little dopamine rush. It's almost like when you get a text message. Oh, somebody must be needing something from me or some new information, right?
Yeah.
It'll distract me from this work that I'm doing that maybe I don't really want to do. I turned that off, and that tiny little thing was magical for me in improving my ability to concentrate and my productivity. What I'm working on next when I'm doing deep work is, of course, to have email shut down altogether. Because what I find is that even though it's not alerting me, my mind is saying, go check email. Hey, go check email. Hey, go see if maybe somebody emailed. Maybe you got that response you've been waiting for that new client that you've been trying to land or whatever it might be. Yeah. And also, of course, turning off my phone so that it's on silent and I don't hear it buzzing, because that's another thing that we are just conditioned to. No matter how much we think, oh, I heard it buzz, I'll check it later. There's a part of your brain that's saying, go check it, go check it, go check it. So that's one simple productivity hack that allows me to have, when I am doing deep work, to stay focused and minimize my interruptions. Yeah. Is there something like that you've been applying recently that helps you?
Yeah, I think in the last 6 months, I bought this little application called Freedom. And what you can do is you can go online and say, I want to shut everything off on my PC for an hour. And so it doesn't allow you to check email. It doesn't allow you to go to the internet. And you can work on other programs, but you can't work on the ones that are distracting. And then if I try to go there, it says, oh, you got another 35 minutes to go. And it shuts everything off on your PC. So it's a cool little tool, and I think it's helpful.
Yeah, I love that, especially when you're first developing that discipline and breaking that habit of consistently checking email. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other one is I bought a clock. I've got a clock that has a regular clock on the left, and on the right, it's got this red dial that sort of covers the time. And then if I want to set up an hour, I can set the timer for that. And I see this red dial going around and removing more and more of the red.
Interesting.
And so if you want 30 minutes or an hour, you can set that up and, say I want an hour, you set it up, and then you watch it kind of tick down.
Very great tools. Yeah. And then this is a physical clock we're talking about.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Wonderful. Great. Thanks for sharing those two tips. As we've alluded to, we've spoken about related topics to this in previous episodes. Just want to highlight a few of them, and I'll have links to them in the show notes page for this episode at thehowofbusiness.com. But on episode 283, I interviewed Chris Ward, and we talked about time management techniques. On episode 52, I had Lauren Midgley on, and we talked about productivity and also some of her time management techniques. And then I did a solo episode 232, where I talked about more of these types of personal productivity tips and hacks. So those are some other episodes of The How of Business that you may want to listen to as you're developing the skills and the habits that help you get to more productive, deep work time. So let's summarize it. Key takeaways from each of us, David, on why deep work, especially from a small business owner's perspective. I mean, he summarizes it. If I took one sentence out of his summary chapter, it's this: deep work generates a life rich with productivity and meaning. There's a lot in that statement, but when I take it and how I translate it to me as a business owner, this influences so much about being a business owner that it's so powerful. Because again, as we said, it allows me, if I start to develop this habit of blocking out deep work blocks of time or focus blocks of time, it means, if I can do it successfully, it means that I have started to, or I have developed a business that isn't completely dependent on me, that I have put in place people and I have empowered them with training and with systems that allow them to operate the business to a great extent. I'm not saying it operates without me entirely, but I am able to then dedicate time to thinking about where I take the business next, to making those hard decisions about the business that someone has to make that require deep thought, And that's going to make me so much more fulfilled and not feel like I'm running around like a crazy person trying to spin all of the plates to keep my business or multiple businesses going. So that's what, at the end, what I take from all of this and how important deep work is. What are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I think if you're going to have a successful business, you've got to be able to do these things, first of all. Second of all, think about people who are in careers who, if you say, oh, that Henry Lopez, he can get things done. He gets so much done. Well, the only way that Henry gets to do that is if he focuses on deep work. And so if you want to be somebody who's going to be, if you will always have a place in this world if you can get deep work done.
Mm-hmm.
And in this day and age, I think that's a great thing to have on your resume, that you can get things done.
And at the same time, we're in an era with the most number of distractions keeping us from that deep work.
Yeah.
Fighting for that time in our minds and in our lives to keep us away from that deep work. So we have to be ruthless about blocking those things out, about saying no, and about developing this habit and being selfish about getting this deep work onto our schedule on a consistent basis.
Agreed.
All right, we'll wrap it up then, David. Any last words before I wrap it up?
No, thanks for having me on this podcast. Enjoyed it and love talking about these types of topics.
Yeah, this is huge for both you and I. We've seen it impact our lives from both sides. And so that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you. I wish all of you listening the best as you start and grow your successful and profitable small business. This is Henry Lopez. My co-host today is David Begin. He hasn't passed yet. Thanks for joining us for this episode of The How of Business. I release new episodes every Monday morning, and you can find the show anywhere you listen to podcasts or at my website, thehowofbusiness.com. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to The How of Business. For more information about our coaching programs, online courses, show notes pages, links, and other resources, please visit thehowofbusiness.com.